right, I think we can start. So, welcome to the 19th meeting of the Princeton-Bucharest virtual seminar. I will be chair today because both Dan and Dana will be late, but hopefully they'll join us a little later. I'm going to ask everyone who's not presenting to turn off their mics so we don't get microphony. The title of our panel for today is Anatomy, Physiology, and Pharmacy from Early Modern Philosophy to Science. We haven't had a history of medicine panel in a while, so this is exciting. Our first speaker is going to be Benny Goldberg from the University of South Florida, who's going to talk to us about notions of experience in early modern anatomy and pharmacy. Benny, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks everybody. Let me try to share my screen. Okay, can people see this? Claudia, can you see this?
Ja, dat is het bestuur van Philip.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. I've had some bad experiences, so I just want to double check. Okay, so why don't I get started? I'll just start my timer here. So that's me, and let's just jump into the material today. So Philip and I are going to be sort of going in different directions. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how some physicians and medical thinkers influence philosophy, and he's going to be showing a little bit of the opposite way about how Spinoza in particular influenced physiology. So today I'm going to discuss some of the ways that experience was thought about and used in the 17th century, focusing on a cast of English characters, in particular comparing learned anatomy and medicine with home-based pharmaceutical production. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to start today by talking about some of the polysemous ways that historians have talked about the idea of experience. So there is, to start with, the idea of experience as kind of familiarity, that is common knowledge gained by ordinary everyday experience. This is what Peter Deer calls Aristotelian or scholastic experience. Then there's the idea of experience as a kind of trial, that is knowledge from a specific perceptual event, that is some test of a particular proposition. So here we think about the experiments and observations of the Royal Society. Then there's an idea of experience as expertise, that is judgment, maybe even wisdom gained from repeated practice. And it's often formulated as experience and reason together. And so today I'm going to talk about in particular the idea of autopsia or personal experience combined with the learned skill or faculty of anatomy. Finally, there's an idea of experience that signifies efficacy. That is, it's a kind of practical knowledge gained by doing various kinds of tasks and seeing how successful they are. So in particular, today I'm going to be talking about the probata sunt or approved recipes created in a kind of practice of experimental pharmacy. So I'm going to talk about all of these in various kinds of ways, but I'm going to focus, as I said, on learned anatomy and home pharmacy. So I'm going to start by introducing the former before moving on and introducing pharmacy in a little bit. So I'm going to focus on a particular tradition, that of Padua, leading up to the thinker I'm going to focus on today, William Harvey. So a lot of English physicians since Thomas Linacre went and trained in Padua across the Renaissance. And Padua is important in our story because of the medical humanist philosophy practiced among the medical faculty at the university. So Jerry Balabil describes humanism as the ability to practice medicine in the manner of the ancient physicians. And in particular, Leonoceno, the founder of the movement, signaled out a couple of areas where they wanted to improve their knowledge, namely medicinal herbs, knowledge of specific diseases, and of anatomical structures. In particular, personal experience, this idea of autopsia, was the basis of the medical humanist teaching. And Buyse writes that from teaching these subjects through demonstration of the phenomena themselves, it's a relatively short but crucial step to the beginnings of substantial new observations. And that leads us to the idea of what were called historiae. So Nancy Sarazi and Gianna Pomata have done some really excellent work demonstrating that key in the development of medical humanism and Renaissance Aristotelianism was a shift towards empiricism. And these innovations occur around the idea of historia. What Pomata writes is that scholastic Aristotelianism and its transition to Renaissance Aristotelianism is a shift from historia as knowledge without cause to historia as knowledge as preparatory for the investigation of causes. And it's these historiae that are really central in the case of Padua and Paduan anatomy. And in fact, I think they are key to understanding Harvey's 17th century discoveries. So I want to just go ahead and I've picked out here some quotes from various Paduans leading up to Harvey on their idea of anatomy. And I want to draw out a couple of things here. First, the way they understand anatomy is about determining the facts of the body, so to speak. That is this idea of figuring out what needs to be explained, what they need to determine the causes of. So what Harvey here calls ocular inspection and dissection determines the what of the body, allowing us to determine the why, uses and actions in the lingo of the physicians. Second, though maybe not explicit in these passages, ocular inspection is associated not just with general experience or the reports of others, but autopsia, that is personal observation and experience. Importantly, the way they thought about autopsia wasn't just a single particular experience, but constant repeated experiences. And indeed, not just experiences passively ingested, but rather manipulation of human and animal bodies in both physic and anatomy. Third, emphasized especially in Philopius and Harvey here, anatomy is a faculty, it's a skill, it's an art. It's not just a body of knowledge. And it's not just routine observation by anybody who could cut open a body. This is actually something we see in Vesalius, right? Vesalius says, look, we've got the surgeons, the barbers on the one hand, they're great at cutting things, but they don't know anything. On the other hand, we have these physicians who know a lot, but they've never spent time dealing with actual bodies, so they can't link their knowledge to reality. So again, what we have is something I mentioned earlier, this link between reason and experience. So in particular, and what we're going to see a little bit in Harvey, what we see is a combination of skill and of reason and experience in a kind of cyclic pattern. That is, they inform each other in the ongoing development of expertise. Now, this is kind of a commonplace thing in a lot of medical writing, but there's a sense in a lot of Renaissance work, medical philosophy, that the debates that you see in, for instance, De Sectis about the ancient medical sects was about dogma over practicality. That is, the best method is combining all of them, except maybe the Methodists. Those guys were a little weird. But you know, the rationalists, the dogmatists, and the empiricists both had elements of the truth. And in fact, we'll return to De Sectis in a bit. Finally, it's important to note that when we talk about autopsia and observations in the Renaissance, we're not talking about observations in passing, but the intense collection and repetition of these kinds of things. That is, they were meticulously recorded in various kinds of ways. Among the Galenic writers, these became formalized across the Renaissance into case books, which were records of disease. in the medieval period, these were known as experimenta or exempla, and they now became part of the larger category of historia, which was the way in which experience, as we're going to see, is meant to be organized. So in anatomy, these descriptions of the parts, their movements, leads to knowledge of their causes. And how they do so is really important. So now I'm going to turn to Harvey. So Harvey has this very bizarre turn of phrase that he uses twice, and so far as I can tell is not really used or picked up. It's only used in his lecture notes, which were not published until, I believe, the 19th century. But he has this idea, the historia, the regula Socratis, which I think is about organizing historia. That is what Philopius calls the art of anatomy, is about a certain kind of method. In his lectures, which were a course called the Lumleian Lectures, given to aspiring surgeons and physicians in London, he writes a lot about the best way to go about doing things. That is the best way to have the right kind of autopsia, to collect the right kind of facts, to generate the right kind of causal inferences, which, because as Jim Lennox has argued, Harvey is a good Aristotelian, he's really concerned with getting the right level of generality when he makes an inference. So in particular here, the rule of Socrates is the idea of comparative anatomy. Comparison shifts the idea of anatomy from the unique, deity-designed human body that was the focus of earlier medical humanism to the idea of living bodies in general, even plants. For Harvey, this was an essential part of creating inferences. And as you can see here, it's useful for finding about disease, finding about causes with a variety of nature, so on and so forth. So for instance, he says elsewhere in the Prelectiones that you need to look in certain ways. So you have to consider the temperament, things which happen by necessity and by chance. You have to consider position, shape, quantity, motion, and division, so on and so forth. So he has a relatively elaborated idea of the kinds of experiences you need to have that generate what I call experienced experience. So why is this so important? Well, it tells us that autopsia must be disciplined, must be assisted by reason, by learned theory. And part of the reason for this is that Harvey was really upset that he spent more than a decade trying to convince people around Europe of the circulation, and they just said, I don't buy it, dude. And in his letters to Riolan, the De Circulatio Sanguinis, he's kind of bitter about it. And he has this really great line that we see here in this first passage. That is, we see his frustration and his idea that experience, some kind of expertise, is necessary to make judgments about, for instance, the circulation. And we see here the idea of what he calls diligent experience, right? And diligent means constantly or steadily applied, right? That is, it's a notion of experience that's through repeated interactions with anatomy. So for instance, we see this in his great work, the De Motu Cordis. That is, organized personal experiences lead to certain sets of historical claims and judgments, and these provide a body of evidence leading to the conclusion that, for instance, the blood circulates. So for instance, in the beginning of chapter 9, he writes that there's 3 things that he has to confirm, one of which is that the blood is transmitted by the pulsation of the heart from the vena cava to the arteries. And then the following chapter, he says that there are 3 forms of evidence which provide for the truth of this argument, namely appeal to calculation, that is a reasoned argument, references to tests, that is experiments, and personal experience, that is autopsia. Now, I want to talk a little bit about experience before moving on to some conclusions here. When he talks about experience, it only indicates a kind of test that can demonstrate to the senses that something has to be true. And it includes, of course, ligature. It includes all kinds of vivisection, but it also includes weird things like old wives' tales. He refers to an old wives' tale as an experiment because it's something that proves a particular thing has to be true. So he doesn't have exactly the modern idea of experiment. Instead, it's linked, I think, very closely with his idea of historia. Okay, so conclusions. So if we look at the larger tradition that arises after Harvey in learned anatomy, what we see is the idea that historia become synonymous with experimenta. That is, Francis Glisson, writing later in the 1670s or later, writes that historia are plena enumeratio experimentorum. And although this isn't exactly true for Harvey, it does show the influence of this idea a little bit going forward. So what I think we have in Harvey is the idea that knowing necessitates doing things, namely anatomy. But doing anatomy necessitates knowing these things, and we get a kind of non-vicious circle, which is just the process by which someone becomes an expert. And in particular, reason and experience go hand in hand. And that's where we come back to De Sectis, where we have this very interesting marginal note written in his copy that investigative reasoning makes a doctor by experience, right? That he thinks the sects are all wrong, that we have instead this combined procedure. Okay, so that's the first half. Now I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and move on to talk about what I call royalist recipes. I mean, if we include Harvey, who's also a royalist, we have a certain intellectual milieu, which involves a lot of figures surrounding the court of eventually King Charles, but especially as we're going to see Queen Henrietta Maria. So this tradition is related in some ways, similar cast of characters sometimes, but has a different social function and origin. The tradition I'm going to talk about is often called kitchen physic in England, and it's connected with the household production of all kinds of things, but in particular, I'm going to focus on the production of medicines. So Elaine Long and Sarah Pennell have called recipe collections textual medicine chests. That is, they signify a resource that a household can use to find a remedy for whatever ailment afflicts anyone in the household. Going back, William Eman has argued that these arise out of medieval books of secrets, basically records of craft knowledge. And they play a really important role in medical education, in particular the education of housewives and noble women. And in particular, I think one of the recipe collections I'm going to look at has a pronounced influence on the work of Margaret Cavendish. Okay, so I'm going to talk about how householders deal with the idea, with generating knowledge about the efficacy of medicines. And I'm going to talk about trials or experiments. But here I'm following an idea of experiment that, against what Peter Deer writes, is different from what we find in, say, Galileo. It's different than the mathematical sciences. They're not carefully controlled manipulations, but are, in fact, in some ways closer to the historical observations of the physicians, especially in their case books. The trials focus on whether or not a medicine works. And when I say works, that doesn't mean people got better. It means usually that they had some very good evacuations, as that was generally the goal of a lot of medicines. Okay, so my method here is gonna be a little bit different. A lot of these writers didn't write explicitly the way that Harvey and the Paduans did about method. Instead, I'm going to be doing a bit more speculation in an attempt to reconstruct a little bit about what their philosophy of science is based on how they use certain words, which we've already seen some instances of. In particular, I'm going to concentrate on this group of royalists surrounding Queen Henrietta Maria. Sorry, my thing. Around Queen Henrietta Maria, starting in Oxford, but eventually when she goes into exile, were a group of very interesting figures, including well-known people like Kenelm Digby and Theodore de Mayerne, the great physician, but also included Margaret Cavendish, the Queen herself, and the two sisters, the Talbot sisters, Elizabeth Howard and Elizabeth Gray and Alethea Howard. During the war, in part because of changing ideas about publication and easing of restrictions, we see the publication beginning in the 1650s of three really remarkable books that mark the first sort of technical treatises written by or at least attributed to women. Namely Elizabeth Gray's A Choice Manual of Rare and Select Secrets, Queen Henrietta Maria's The Queen's Closet Opened, and Alethea Talbot Howard's Natura ex Enterrata. At the same time, we have a manuscript created by Margaret and William Cavendish, which I'm going to talk about, which is very similar and in some ways directly related to these other recipe books. And they all represent a kind of shared ideal and common goal, namely to produce household medicines in kitchens, in distilleries, using herbs gathered from one's property, as well as all sorts of chemicals from the apothecary shop and elsewhere. There's a lot of really good writing on this. Lynette Hunter has talked about how the social and political atmosphere allowed for interactions between these high status women and a variety of the sort of canonical figures of early modern experimentalism in medicine in England. Okay, so I'm gonna briefly talk about these texts. I'm gonna start with the Talbot sisters. The Talbot sisters were part of a very politically powerful family, although they had some political trouble as well. I'm not going to go into details. But what's important is that they were educated during a period of vernacular humanism, not so different from what was going on in Padua, except here we see a kind of odd mixture of herbalism, alchemy, and Paracelsian sort of iatro medicine developed as not just a sort of philosophy, but as a set of practices. And it was often developed through observation. That is, there's a lot of tacit knowledge here. One of the reasons we have fewer sort of methodological pronouncements. So just to briefly introduce these figures, Aubrey talks about Gray, attests to her reputation as a physician and apothecary. And in particular, her book went through 19 editions well into the 18th century. In particular, she has a powder called the Countess of Kent's powder, which is mainly powdered crab's eyes. I've heard it works wonders. Her work is really influential. The great cook of the late 17th century, Robert May, cites her work as deeply influential. Natura Enterrata, that is nature ex enterrata, disemboweled, is a huge book. And what we see with both of these volumes are a lot of recipes in common, representing a kind of similar background manuscript practice, which involved the trade and gift of recipes, especially among these royalists. Okay. There's also this manuscript called PWV 90. I've actually been working on this manuscript. I'm producing an edition of it and commentary, but it was written during this same period and collects a bunch of medical advice and recipes, including some by Margaret Cavendish herself. We don't know the exact amount she was involved with it, but we do know that she was certainly part of its collection and organization. It's a really interesting work, although significantly smaller than these other recipe collections. Okay, so just to sort of step back for a second, I want to say what the connection is to medicine and to the ideas of experience. And in particular, a number of scholars like Wendy Wall and Pamela Smith have argued that this literature is connected to an idea of experiment that is similar to, although with a somewhat different origin, to what goes on in the Royal Society with Boyle and other more well-known experimental philosophers. It's sometimes called maker's knowledge or artisanal epistemology, or sometimes domestic science. And that's what I'm going to concentrate on for the 5 minutes remaining that I have. So the way I started was I simply looked at all the words that seem to signify experience in all of these and looked at their frequency, and then looked in each case at how they were used. And we see a couple of patterns. One, we have this phrase probatum est, it's proved, which is usually a record of a very specific test by a specific individual. Especially in natura exenterata, it's often linked with a particular person. And in a similar way, as we saw in Harvey, not everyone can be a good probatum est provider. There are shades of the Chapin thesis, that is the idea that they had to be in high standing, but I don't think that's actually what's really relevant here. What's really relevant is these people were the right kind of experts. That is, they were apothecaries, they were physicians, they were herb wives or good wives who had experience with all of these various recipes and cures. Okay, so let me get into a couple of more specific examples. So for instance, in the sort of introduction to the work, we have a part of the sort of advertisement for it is this idea that the experience of all of these various people, especially people of quality, is what vouchsafes their idea of their efficacy. We also see the repeated use of the word experiment just to mean recipe in general. But we also have this idea of tried, and the idea isn't a specific experimental test, but simply the idea that a medicine was literally tried and it seemed to do what it was meant to do. In the Cavendish manuscript, we have somewhat more interesting ruminations, in part because of the learned nature of some of the commentators, such as Dr. Davison, who was a physician to the Queen, and Mayerne, who was physician to numerous kings. So for instance, Mayerne opines here that it's not the opinion of the multitude, but that experience is my reason. It's a statement not so far different from what Harvey wrote in the marginalia of his copy of De Sectis. Again, we have this idea that certain medicines conform to experience. That is the repeated test of these cures, in particular, a nasty combination of mercury and gold, that would certainly not be good for you, but according to Dr. Davidson, it will fix you right up. And then, of course, we also have the idea that certain medicines are themselves experienced or approved, as they're sometimes called. Okay, so briefly, just to Cavendish, I don't have a lot of time here, but I think there's an important influence here. In particular, in the Observations upon Experimental Philosophy, she's neither against experiment nor experience, but I think she has a different conception of it than some of those later experimental philosophers. In particular, she thinks of it as at least in part, as a kind of expertise gained through repeated personal experiences. And in addition, it's pretty clear in this work that she doesn't think that the Galenists or other kind of scholastic medical practitioners are to be rejected. Instead, we see a kind of combined idea of the new and the old, something that is, I think, very central to the kind of medical humanism we see in some of the participants in both of these traditions. Okay, couple of conclusions about recipe books. Experience and experienced medicines tend to indicate not acts, but long processes of testing. Probatum est can sometimes be an individual experience, but not always. Experiment sometimes means tested or tried, but often just refers to a recipe. Okay, let's get to the more interesting conclusions, which are similarities and differences. So First, there's a close link between experience and wisdom. And in fact, experience often refers in both of these traditions as a kind of expertise or expert judgment, the kind of minimal quality needed in order to make confident assertions about the efficacy of a medicine or about the causes of the parts, their actions, uses, and utilities. Finally, evidential weight is given to particular tests, trials, and observations with respect to particular judgments, but in neither tradition are experiments or tests the be-all, end-all of the epistemological process. Finally, there are some important differences, namely how they write, how we go about trying to understand their philosophy of science. The Paduans have a very explicit and highly refined idea of method. Among the householders, it's much more ambiguous, with a lot left to sort of tacit knowledge gained through working within that household. And finally, they have different goals, right? Householders want to heal, the anatomists seek knowledge of the causes of the parts of the body. So that's it for my presentation. I just thought I'd end on a couple of ideas about what's going on here historiographically. And these are just some of the issues, but because I'm out of time, I'm just going to go ahead and let Philip do his presentation. Thanks, everyone, very much. We're going to be taking questions combined at the end. So if you have a question, just note it down. If you don't, you got plenty of time to think of one. Okay. Thanks very much. Now,
Thank you very much, Benny. I'm going to stop your sharing now.
Oh, thanks.
Okay.
I didn't know how. Okay.
Great. And now we can move on to Philip. Philip asked me to tell you that he has a draft of the paper available. So I will put his email in the chat in case you want to drop him a line and get the paper. Okay. So Philip will be talking about Spinoza and Johannes Müller, how the Dutch philosopher inspired the German father of contemporary physiology. Philip, the floor is yours.
Hello. So first I will share my screen.
Perfect.
I hope that you can see my screen now.
Yes.
First of all, thank you very much to Dan, who's not here, and also Claudia for having me here today as part of this Princeton-Bucharest seminar. It's an excellent idea to organize this one seminar online during this pandemic and to put it on YouTube. The subject that I want to treat today is the relation between the 17th century thinker Spinoza and the 19th century physiologist Johannes Peter Müller, who is regarded to be the father of contemporary physiology. How did I come to this subject? Well, some years ago I was invited to give a presentation during a conference for neurobiologists after Wade and Piccolino had published a new book entitled Galileo's Visions on Galileo's sensory physiology and its reception. In this book, the psychologist and neuroscientist argued that Galileo's ideas expressed in the essayer were transmitted via Locke and Kant and subsequently transmitted via Müller into contemporary physiology. However, when I examined Müller's work, I noticed that the German physiologist never mentions Galileo and did not have any works of the Italian physicist in his personal library. In addition, I had the impression that busy with a PhD project on Spinoza and Galileo, that Müller might have been influenced and inspired rather by Spinoza. This challenged me to have a more in-depth look at Müller's work, which, as I had expected, includes several references to Spinoza's work. To my surprise, at that moment, there was not really literature on Müller and Spinoza, although there is during the last decades much interest among neurobiologists, Damasio, Changeau, and Atlan included for Spinoza's philosophy. Likewise, I couldn't find any biography of Müller which has Spinoza included in its reference of names. The most recent important publication on Müller and his work, entitled Müller's Lab by Laura Otis, does not include Spinoza either. Only in a few publications, rather in the area of psychology, for instance by Walter Bernhardt and Hagner and Martin Farrell, examine Spinoza's role in psychology. connect us to a certain extent with Müller. Spinoza is today one of the most popular early modern philosophers. Müller, by contrast, needs much more introduction today, I guess. Therefore, before I continue, something more about his life and his work. The German physiologist was born in Koblenz, where he did his gymnasium. Afterward, the shoemaker's son went to study medicine in Bonn, where he obtained in 22 his degree in doctoral with a doctoral thesis on the patterns of animal movement, especially in insects. After completing his doctorate, he went to study as a postdoctoral student with the Berlin anatomist and physiologist Karl Asmund Rudolphi. Under his supervision, Müller quickly became a skillful microscopist before he returned to Bonn in the winter of 1824. In the same year, he became professor at the newly founded Friedrich Wilhelm University of Bonn. When Rudolphi died in 1832, Müller obtained his Berlin professorship of anatomy and physiology. In 1833, he went to the University of Berlin, where he filled this chair until his death. From 1833 until 1848, he worked to make Berlin a center for physiology and comparative anatomical studies and became the director of Berlin's Anatomical Museum. In the years 34 and 40, he published 2 volumes of his Handbuch der Physiologie des Menschen, which were directly an enormous international success. This monumental, extremely influential work was translated in 1845 by Jourdan in France and in 38 and 42 by William Bailey in English as Elements of Physiology. Subsequently, Müller's ideas spread out rapidly all over the world, all over Western Europe rather, and in 1854 the German physiologist received the prestigious Copley Medal of the Royal Society. Based on their biographies, Müller and Spinoza seem to have not much in common. However, we may not forget that the lens grinder Spinoza was just as Müller a skillful microscopist, and even besides Hudde and Huygens, one of the leading microscopists of Holland at that time. And Spinoza does not include anatomy in his writings, except in the preface of the 5th part of the Ethics, but there is no doubt that he was very interested in anatomy. He had several anatomics in his personal library. What's more, according to a document by the anatomist Steno, Spinoza visited in 61, not exceptionally, but on a daily basis, the anatomy dissections at the University of Leiden. Furthermore, several members of his circle, his master Franciscus van den Ende, Kerkering, Courbach, De Vries, Van Veldhuizen, and his best friend Lodewijk Meyer included study medicine. And remarkably, Leibniz introduced his letter to Spinoza with the phrase "Ah, Monsieur Spinoza, médecin très célèbre et philosophe très profond." And now I arrive at my second part. When and where does Müller mention Spinoza? Müller was a very productive writer. Between 1822 and 1848, the workaholic published more than 250 articles and books, all written in German. Interestingly, the German physiologist mentions Spinoza in 2 of these publications, indicated in red on the slide, included in the following overview with the selection of his most important publications. The reference to Spinoza's view is very explicit in Müller's main work, Handbuch der Physiologie des Menschen, which consists of 2 parts. Amazingly, in the 2nd volume of this very influential work, the German physiologist quotes during 6 pages literally propositions from the 3rd part of the Ethics. This is the part wherein Spinoza discusses his definitions of affecta or emotions of human beings. Why does Müller copy here so literally from Spinoza's Ethics? At the first glance, the answer seemed to be given by Müller himself just prior to the passage in question. With regard to the relations of the passions to one another, apart from their physiological conditions, it is impossible to give any better account than that which Spinoza has laid down with unsurpassed mastery. End quote. Spinoza's name occurs, however, also on other pages of the second volume of the Handbuch der Physiologie, in chapters where he discusses other subjects than emotions. More precisely in the second section of Book 4 of the second volume, where Müller introduces the phenomenon of dreaming, other explicit occurrences of Spinoza's name are included in Book 6, entitled Von Zielenleben, of the mind, of the same volume. More precisely, in the first section, Müller explains his views on scientific methodology, which I explain later. Furthermore, Spinoza's name occurs in the second section, where the German physiologist clarifies his views on the possibility of animals having effects. And in the third section, entitled Von der Wechselwirkung der Seele und der Organismus, Müller refers to Spinoza's letter 30 to his friend Peter Balling, wherein the phenomenon of imagination as a cause of visual sensory deception is discussed, which, as he explains, encouraged him to do self-experiments. Interestingly, Müller had mentioned the same letter already in his early work über die fantastischen Gesichtserscheinungen on fantasy images, published in 26, written when he was only 25 years old. At that time he was a young professor in Bonn. Already on the first page of this work, which he regarded as a prolongation of his former work entitled Zur vergleichenden Physiologie des Gesichtssinns, on the comparative physiology of vision in man and animals, he mentions Spinoza 2 times at the moment he introduces his sensory physiology of vision. Remarkably, Müller emphasizes in the same preface that he would only refer to the last 3 of the 5 parts of Spinoza's Ethics in order to exclude any accusation of Spinozism. But why did Müller quote in these passages so explicitly from Spinoza's work, rather than from other early modern philosophers whose work he knew, the work of Descartes, for instance, included? This question brings us to the next section, which discusses several elements from Spinoza's work that might have inspired Müller and explain why he chose for Spinoza's philosophy. There is no doubt that one of the main reasons why Müller was inspired by Spinoza's philosophy must be found in the historical context. In Germany, as a result of criticism of the Bible during the Enlightenment, the question arose of the role of religion. After Luther, the authority of the Roman Church was less powerful, which created a certain emptiness. Under the influence of some leading thinkers such as Hegel, his students Heine and Schelling, Spinoza's pantheism, which had become a hidden religion, as Heine put it, appeared at the surface and became extremely influential in the region where the young Müller studied. Müller was raised as a Catholic, and as a young boy he had even considered becoming a Roman priest. According to the 20th century historian of physiology, Karl Rotschu, he would later even associate the study of nature with religion and considered those who practiced it as akin to priests. This explains why he hid his connection with Spinoza's heretical metaphysics, which refuted the traditional concept of God. Spinoza's philosophy, however, allowed him to think about God, nature and man in a different way, which, as we will explain further, was essential for the founding of his new science. From the start of his career, Müller was deeply convinced that philosophy was needed in order to ground his new physiology. On October the 19th of the year 1844, Müller delivered his inaugural lecture über das Bedürfnis der Physiologie nach einer philosophischen Naturbetrachtung, on the need of physiology for a philosophical contemplation of nature, in which he outlined a scientific strategy he would use for the rest of his life. At that time he worked at the University of Bonn, which was the medical faculty included a bastion of Schelling's natural philosophy. Consequently, the young Müller absorbed Spinozistic ideas. Hence, understandably, Spinoza's philosophy was a possible candidate to ground his new physiology. However, there may also be other elements, which brings us to the next section. As he made clear from the start of his career, Müller wanted to give a physiological explanation for psychological phenomena. He aimed at founding a new science which allowed them to explain phenomena that were traditionally considered to be psychological in a physiological way. Moreover, already in his doctoral dissertation, he argued that no one can be a psychologist without being a physiologist. At the first glance, this might seem contradictory, given the fact that he defined physiology as the science of living bodies and their phenomena. But as he clarified in his inaugural lecture, psychology was only separated from physiology to the extent that philosophy separated the mind to the body. Die Physiologie und höhere Psychologie sind so wenig getrennt, als die Philosophie den Gegensatz von Geist und Körper anerkennt. Importantly, Spinoza's ontology allowed him to fill the gap between psychology and physiology. Indeed, according to Spinoza's ontology, very fundamentally there exists only one unique eternal substance, and all existing things are modes of that substance. Ontological idea and body are one and the same thing, though conceived from two different attributes. In other words, the mind and body are in Spinoza's view one and the same psychophysical reality, being a modus of nature and being governed by the same inexorable laws of nature. More concretely, let's focus now on three topics from Spinoza's philosophy that were important for Müller's sensory science: memory or emotion, memory, affects or emotions, and imagination, in order to illustrate how Spinoza's double aspect theory allowed Müller to integrate psychological phenomena into physiology. First of all, Spinoza defines two times in his work memory, in one of his earliest works, The Emendation of the Intellect, and in the Scholium of Proposition 18 of Part 2 of the Ethics. Of memory, he writes in the former text, is nothing but a sensation of impressions on the brain, together with the thought of a determinate duration of the sensation. Obviously, the Dutch philosopher denies the existence of a purely intellectual memory. Importantly, Spinoza denies also that affects, emotions or passions, and affections, rather impressions, are purely mental. Indeed, in the third definition of the third part of the Ethics, the Dutch philosopher writes, I quote, "By affect I understand affections of the body, by which the body's power of affecting is increased or diminished, aided or restrained, and at the same time the ideas of these affections." It is important to notice that according to this definition, an affect or an emotion is always an affection with an extra condition, and that generally speaking, emotions have always a physical as well as a psychological aspect. Hence, affections and emotion are psychophysical entities. Consequently, the vitalist Müller could, within Spinoza's double aspect conceptual framework, treat affections and emotions in a materialistic, physiological way without reducing them to their physical aspects. Thirdly, Spinoza considered imaginatio, neither as something purely intellectual. On the contrary, imagination includes the affection of the body as well as the ideas of this affection. And Spinoza defines imagining as having ideas of this kind of affection. I quote, "To retain the customary words, the affection of the human body, whose ideas present external bodies as present to us, we shall call images of things, even if they do not reproduce the figures of things. And when the mind regards bodies in this way, we shall say it imagines. End quote. Similar things can be said about hallucinations, illusions, after images, daydreams, dreams, nightmares, and so on. In Spinoza's view, the human body is affected in many ways by external bodies which create traces, vestigia, in the affected body. Simultaneously with these bodily affections, there are ideas of these affections which may undergo deformations, adaptations, changes as a result of new affection. However, this altered affection and their ideas or images, as Spinoza put it, might present things which are not physical present or things which simply do not or cannot exist in the external world. In the 3 first decades of the 19th century, our views on hallucination changed fundamentally from the ancient notion of apparition into the current concept of hallucination, meaning the generic name for a class of utterances reporting subjective experiences, perceptual in nature, which occur in the absence of an adequate external stimulus. As the Cambridge professor Buyse puts it, in this transformation, Müller's über die fantastische Gesichtserscheinungen on fantasy images, published in 26, was an important catalyst, although this classic text does not feature in official histories of hallucination in psychiatry. However, amazingly, in his discussion, Buyse does not include Spinoza, although the German physiologist quotes already in the 6th section of the first part, which treat the theory of fantasy images of this early work literally from Spinoza's letter 17 to Peter Balling in order to clarify his innovative views on hallucinations. Obviously, this reference to Spinoza is significant since 30 years later he comes several times back to this passage in his magnum opus Elements of Physiology, referring in a note explicitly to the passage, which indicate that his views on this topic were quite stable throughout his career. But what is Spinoza's letter 17 to Peter Balling about? In this letter, the Dutch philosopher tries to console his friend just after the terrible sudden loss of a young child. In a former letter, the mnemonid merchant had informed Spinoza that he had heard his son uttering some groans just before he died. Spinoza replies that his utterances were probably mere imagination. He clarifies his interpretation by means of his own visual hallucination experience. What was there so important about Spinoza's explanation of Müller's analysis of the hallucination process? Several key elements which would be essential for the way Müller changed our views on hallucinations are at stake here. Firstly, Spinoza had naturalized hallucinations. This kind of phenomenon became natural kinds, caused by natural causes and in principle completely definable and analyzable in physical terms. Secondly, in Spinoza's example, sensible ideas are generated independently from the will of the observer. Moreover, there exists no free will in the ordinary sense of the word according to Spinoza. Thirdly, the vivid images which appear as real during hallucinations do not present real external objects. Hallucinations refer to the experience of hearing, seeing, or smelling things that are not there. In this letter, Spinoza is quite clear he had never seen the scabby Brazilian before. Fourthly, hallucinations are not restricted to the visual. They can also appear to the other senses. What happened to me in respect of my internal sense of sight happened to you in respect of hearing. That's what Spinoza told to his friend in his letter. Fifthly, these ideas constitute a medical problem. If the content is considered to be real, people become, as it were, victim of their own fantasy, which has theological as well as ethical implication, as Manfred Walter has pointed out in his new volume. All these Spinozistic elements, which would historically transform our conception of hallucination, were essential in Müller's physiology of hallucination. Müller's theory of hallucination had also implications for his attitude towards religious appearances and religious mysticism, which he now conceived as physiological phenomena. And also in this context, he refers and quotes in the same book literally to Spinoza's work. This is interesting given the fact that it shows that Müller had a good knowledge of Spinoza's work, not only of his correspondence and his main work, the Ethics, but also of the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, the theological political treatise. One of the most important innovative ideas of Johannes Müller is his so-called doctrine of specific nerve energies, which state that the modality of the sensation produced by different stimuli on a given nerve is relatively independent of the nature of the stimuli, but is a specific expression of the sensory nerve stimulated. In this doctrine, the influence of Spinozistic ideas is particularly evident. According to Walter Bernhard, Müller developed this first version of the law of specific nerve energies while he was reading Spinoza, long before he started to study Kant. So it certainly makes sense to indicate here in this context the link with Spinoza. Indeed, obviously, Müller's doctrine echoes the views expressed in Proposition 16 of the second part of Spinoza's Ethics, which state that the idea of any mode wherein the human body is affected by external bodies must involve the nature of the human body together with the nature of external body. Descartes had blamed Galilei not to have a metaphysical foundation for his among others for his primary secondary distinction. Spinoza gives here a foundation based on his ideas of causation. When a sensitive body is affected by an external body, there is an idea of this affection simultaneously with the bodily affection. In Spinoza's view, a bodily affect is always caused by a finite mode of the same attribute, in other words, another body. However, according to axiom 4 of the Deo, an idea of an effect always involves its cause, but since there are two causes, the affected and the affecting body, here the idea of the affection involves the idea of two bodies. So the idea is, as a consequence, confused or inadequate, as he put it. Moreover, Spinoza reveals in the two corollaries which he adds to this proposition that the primarily idea which we have of things does represent much more the actual status of the affected body than the external bodies that affect me. Basically, this is precisely the idea that is expressed in one of the most essential ideas of Müller's sensory physiology, his doctrine of specific nerve energies. Another reason why Müller chose for Spinoza has to do with his views on scientific methodology and Spinoza's theory of knowledge. In his handbook, Müller argues that in science in general and physiology in particular, scientists should follow the geometrical method. Importantly, Spinoza is the only philosopher he mentions in this context. And as Müller recalls in his handbook in the preface of the third part of the Ethics, Spinoza had announced that he would treat human actions and appetites just as it were questions of lines, planes, and bodies. It's relevant to notice that Spinoza Spinoza's geometrical methods was very coherent with his theory of knowledge and his notion of necessity and law of nature, which were also echoed by Müller in the same section. However, Müller is often presented in literature as a great experimentalist. However, the fact is that he was, just as Spinoza, extremely critical about scientific experiments, which he regarded as, I quote, artificial, impatient, busy, digressive, passionate, and unreliable, end quote. And just as Spinoza, he was very critical about new sophisticated scientific equipment. Instead, he preferred direct observation in combination with reflection, philosophical observation, as he put it. Spinoza expressed his views on experimentation in his correspondence with Robert Boyle via Oldenburg, wherein he commented experiments Boyle had explained in his Physiological Essays, published in 1961. Spinoza was not impressed, not at all, and argued that those scientific experiments, the red integration experiment was the basic experiment, that those experiments are redundant and do not prove anything. Following Bacon, he opposed experimentum to experimentia vaga. With experiments, he argued, you try per definition to control the circumstances, but in his view this is an illusion, because this controlling is too much based on sensible knowledge, which is in his view always inadequate and necessarily leads to inadequate ideas. Instead, Spinoza preferred experience, daily experience, experientia vaga, as a starting point for knowledge. Müller was not just a physiologist, he was above all a comparative physiologist and a comparative anatomist who was fascinated to comprehend the relationships among living animals. Remember that he was in Berlin the director of the university's anatomical museum, where he spent much of his time controlling Prussia's finest comparative anatomical collection. Related to this point, there is another reason why he chose for Spinoza's philosophy. I focus on this for the last 5 minutes. Spinoza applies often comparison with animals, spiders, bees, horses, worms, to clarify his views on the human nature. And already in his early work, De Cogitata Metaphysica, the Dutch philosopher expelled the traditional concept of an immaterial soul that functions as a way to distinguish between plants, animals, human beings, and non-living beings. Consequently, the human body lost its priority among other bodies. According to Spinoza, the human body was not anymore an empire in the empire imperium in imperio. It was not anymore situated in the scala naturae, in the great chain of being just under God and the angels. On the contrary, the human body was governed by the same universal laws as all other bodies and became a model for all bodies in nature. Spinoza did not only refute the traditional way of distinguishing between bodies, he also refuted the Cartesian, strictly mechanical view of animal bodies, which was very innovative in his time. Indeed, the Dutch philosopher categorically refuted Descartes' concept of l'animal machine, and in contrast to his contemporaries, whose work he knew well, Christian Huygens and Robert Boyle included, he never applies in an explicit way the model of the man-made machine, such as the pendulum clock, to explain his views on nature in general and the human body in particular. According to the Dutch philosopher, by contrast, animals have, just as humans, affects, as he argues on several occasions in the Ethics. This very modern idea is a very was a very attractive philosophical idea for a comparative physiologist like Müller. This explains why in his handbook the German physiologist obviously refers in this context to the passage from the fourth part of the Ethics, wherein the Dutch philosopher had made his point. Inspired by Spinoza, Müller even dared to speak of consciousness in animals, which was still scientific heresy for many, even 100 years later. And now I arrive at my conclusion. Spinoza was a philosopher, not a physiologist, just as Müller was a physiologist and not a philosopher. But there is no doubt that Spinoza was very interested in anatomy and microscopy, just as Müller needed a philosophy to ground his new physiology. As I have shown, Müller chose for Spinoza's philosophy not only because of historical, but also because of epistemological and methodological reasons. In my reading, however, the most important reason was ontological, Spinoza's monism and his double aspect theory. A Spinozistic element Müller tries to hide, being afraid to be accused of Spinozism. Often it is said and written that Spinoza was interested in the new science, but did not play an important role in the history of science. But as I have tried to show, his impact on Müller gives a clear example of how the Dutch philosopher played a significant role in the founding of a new science, the contemporary physiology. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Philip. Okay, so now we can just go to the joint Q&A. There are a few questions for Benny so far and one for Philip, and more will come. So maybe let's start with Gabriel Finkelstein's first question for Benny.
Okay.
Great.
Let me figure out how to do things. Okay.
You can read it out so that the people on YouTube can also.
Sure. The question is, what is the relation of medical autopsy to New World autopsy? Vivian Nutton has remarked about Vesalius that the rise of experience as new source of authority has to be traced to anatomy as much as exploration. Do you agree with this assessment, or are you suggesting that traditional sources of authority provide stronger lines of continuity from the past 2 year period? So it's complicated. That's the weasel statement. I think that these kinds of historical changes are always overdetermined. That is, there's lots of things going on here that had various kinds of impacts. In the story I'm trying to tell, we see, oh no, sorry guys, there's gonna be some dog barking soon. I'm gonna apologize in advance for that. There's really, very sorry guys. I'm gonna put you on mute for 1 second while these.
That's
so,
okay.
Sorry guys, too many dogs. The autopsy we speak of in the anatomical tradition here is based on these old authorities, but it's also a new kind of practice, right? One of the things that I think is really interesting about the Renaissance period is just how they're very eclectic, and what they do is they sort of mix and match. There's this attempt to try to make everyone in the past agree on something, whether or not it was something any one of them would have agreed to. That being said, I don't think it's that these traditional authorities are the only lines of continuity or difference here. So one of the big differences is the social and institutional practices. So the practice of anatomy is institutionalized in the period I'm talking about. And it's right. So Harvey's teaching a course that had been going on since Queen Elizabeth. So the relationship to authority is not always the same. I think it's ecumenical, but they're not worried about transgressing it in any kind of way. Thanks. It's a really good question. I'm not sure if I addressed it very well, but that's.
Thank you. Dolores, do you want to ask your question? Let's see if we can hear you. Oh,
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
yeah.
So I was surprised, Benny, that thanks, by the way, thanks for your presentation. Always wonderful to hear from you. So I was a little surprised in your slide that you equated the kind of recipe knowledge with wisdom, because in any kind of traditional classification of knowledge or empirical epistemological, tree of porphyry or tree of knowledge in the early modern period, the kind of knowledge that you're talking about in terms of recipe knowledge is usually considered an empirical knowledge or knowledge of the empirics. So I was curious about whether or not you could flesh out why you were talking about that kind of knowledge as wisdom. And my guess is that you want to equate the maker's knowledge with the kind of feel for knowledge of wisdom, the way a wise woman treating a sick person has a kind of feel for the knowledge, which is a kind of wisdom that someone who's university educated and learned would not have that kind of feel for knowledge, but would be following some sort of theoretical framework for how to cure a patient. And I have a good quote. If that's what you're looking for, I have a good quote from Francis Bacon, who says that no wonder people prefer the treatment of wise women to learned doctors, because the wise women always get the right results, or often get the right results, and the learned doctors get nervous about their knowledge because they don't have a feel for it, a maker's knowledge feel for it. And so they second guess themselves and start to give different doses so that the first dose won't work. So I was wondering if that was the kind of thing that you were talking about. And if indeed that is the thing you were talking about, I wonder why you left out Boyle's recipes in the list that you gave of all of the non-famous people, because De Meo's work on Boyle's medical recipes is consistent with the kind of story you're telling about Cavendish.
Right. So I'll address the last first because it's the easiest. It's just, these are the texts I've been working on.
Okay.
That's the practical reason. Also, they're related in a way that the Boyle's and his sister's recipes are a bit later. And while they have connections in terms of, people, there's a time and a place that really connects these other people, the female writers. They're all surrounding this particular court. That being said, Boyle stuff is really relevant.
Yeah, I should say one more thing, and that is, having looked at all of these, or lots of these medical texts and medical recipes in the Royal Society, you have to be really careful about flattening out the landscape that they're all the same. Because, for instance, the recipes on poisons, they're not only, incredibly practical. So, there's this antidote that you can get, which someone found in Burma and we've imported, and you can get it at such and such an apothecary, something really practical like that. And then other accounts of poisons which go back to Dioscorides and give a historical
Theriac, all these crazy things. There's one in the recipe book I'm looking at that calls for a unicorn horn.
Right.
Which is really hard to get, really, really tricky to get.
Well, it's rhinoceros horn, really.
No, rhinoceros horn is the next ingredient.
Oh, right.
So it's definitely not rhinoceros horn. It could be narwhal.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. And even within the recipe book, they're not necessarily consistent in terms of the advice. And in fact, William Cavendish asks everyone he knows, which is a lot of people, and it upsets some of the other physicians because they're used to not being treated in that way. But to go back to your larger question, I think the comparison with Bacon and this quote that you pointed out is kind of what I'm talking about. That is, I don't think that they're the same thing, and I think everyone involved would be offended at my comparison of them. But I think part of what's going on is that the ancient categories that people are using to talk about and understand themselves aren't applying in exactly the same way. And so I don't think exactly the same sets of things are going on in each of these traditions, but we have a kind of convergence in the way that both the empiric and the learned physician, at least some of the learned physicians, talk about the role of experience, even though the empiric is going to say that, you know, the learned physician is just trying to cheat you, and the learned physician would say the empiric doesn't actually know anything. And what's really interesting to me are these interface areas where we have in recipe books people like Theodore de Mayerne at the same time as other, you know, The Good Wife and Cavendish's own offering of a medical recipe. It's this was what first sort of let me see the connection, was the fact that, you know, we see similar sorts of ideas and practices being used. In particular, one of the practices that I think is interesting is the way in which what the physicians call autopsia is really central to everyone, right? That is, these personal experiences and also its relation to what I call expertise. That is, that takes a long time to often develop these kinds of skills. And I think you find them in both traditions. They're talked about in a little bit of different ways, but there is this kind of convergence. I mean, thank you so much for your question. And if you could give me the location of that Bacon quote, I would really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Julie Walsh.
Thanks so much. Benny, we've never met, but hi. Really enjoyed your talk. And I'm just sort of curious, I see this as a follow-up to some of the stuff you were responding to Dolores about, but I'm sort of curious about your thoughts about sort of the gendered or the genderization of maker's knowledge. And the thing you said that really kind of got me thinking about this was the fact that reputation is involved in legitimizing the experimental knowledge. And given that women were excluded, so many women were excluded from the places where that reputation and thus that legitimacy would be conferred. I just wonder if you see, you know, maker's knowledge as being sort of associated with women's knowledge. Of course, I know that it wasn't just women doing that kind of thing, but I wonder if there's sort of a undercurrent of devaluation that has to do with the sort of person who might be practicing this kind of knowledge. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. This is super relevant. I mean, I'm going to talk mostly about England because I don't really know about anything else. But at least in England, it's really explicit. So Margaret Pelling has a great book where she looks into the history of the Royal College of Physicians. And one of the things that they're doing is literally bringing female medical practitioners in and castigating them, punishing them. There's a real attempt in their attempt to control the medical marketplace to devalue maker's knowledge in general, that is these empirics, the apothecaries, right, all sorts of groups, and replace it with the idea that only the Royal College of Physicians and their appointed apothecaries are the ones who can be dispensing this kind of knowledge. And of course, women are in particular evaluated. At the same time, I mean, what's going on with the works I'm looking at is a bit weird because it happens during the war, and there's this sort of unlikely confluence of these noble women as well as people like Digby and Mayerne, and they're all interacting in a way that didn't necessarily happen in at least the earlier part of the 17th century in England. And this allows for this kind of really interesting mixture of galenic and chemical medicine and practical experimentation. But what we see across the rest of the 17th century is our fights about the proper place of women in the medical marketplace, as well as what I called kitchen physic in medicine. And one of the things we see across the latter half is, although we see lots and lots of recipe books, they begin to be the more familiar recipe books that focus mostly on food. So at the same time, we've got this other thing going on, which is the shift from the Galenic idea that food is medicine to the idea that food and medicine are different sorts of things and they require different sorts of skills. And this, of course, has an effect on the maker's knowledge tradition as well, because this Galenic idea is really central to their whole mode of operating. So absolutely, there's a lot of this stuff going on, and there is a gendered aspect. I don't think it's super clear cut between maker's knowledge and women and men's knowledge and learned knowledge, or however we want to talk about it. But I think that is one of the ways that it cuts. And of course, I've only started on this. You probably know, but there's lots of really, really great work by all sorts of scholars on this stuff. I would just mention Elaine Leong's work and Sarah Pennell and Michelle DeMio. They've all done some really awesome stuff on the way in which gender sort of operates as a kind of controlling force in how these discourses proceed. So thank you so much for your question. Nice to meet you.
Thank you so much. And just so I'm clear, when you were talking about controlling the marketplace, did you mean the kind of controlling the economics of the marketplace and or the epistemological gatekeeping?
Yes to both. So they have this charter given to them by the king, and they literally try to stamp out. They bring people for not knowing enough Galen, and it doesn't work. Because people are like, you guys are terrible. I'm going to go down to the horse leech down the street. But they really try. And so we have both this epistemological component, which you can see in some of the manuscript records. And you can also see it in terms of the economics, in terms of the fines and the way in which they try to control this kind of stuff. Thank you.
Thank you. I actually have a question for Philip. Philip, I was wondering, how serious is the accusation of Spinozism still in the 19th century? And do you know how common this strategy is that the young Müller is trying to do to sort of separate the parts of Spinoza that it's fine to appropriate versus the philosophy?
Yeah, to my knowledge, it's exceptional to do that. Because Spinozism, as I tried to explain, was quite popular in certainly in the Bond area at that moment. I think we have to be aware of the fact that when he wrote this, he was young. He was a young professor, and his references to Spinoza were not so open than later on. So. I think he wouldn't have written this later on in his Handbuch der Physiologie, but he wrote this in a young, as a young professor, and so he took care because the fact that he had a Roman background plays here an important role in my view, in my interpretation. Several scholars have pointed out that he in fact was very religious at a young age, so this played a role certainly in his young career.
I see. Okay. Thank you. There are no more questions now in the chat, so please write them or raise your hand. I also have a question for Benny, but it is a very ignorant question. So you were talking about how the idea of experiment that people were using was closer to Historia, and instead of like the experiment we're familiar with from the natural philosophy side. And you mentioned a point about evacuation, about how it's not about people getting better, but about achieving this sort of target. And I was sort of wondering why that is not taken as a sort of, empirical standard that you're supposed to achieve. Like, see what follows. You try this and you see if we hit the parameter, and how that is different from, hitting another parameter, such as like you're getting better or.
Well, I was being a little facetious. Of course, getting better is important, but the way in which getting better is manifests itself really has to do with what they thought they were supposed to be doing, which was changing your humoral balances in all kinds of ways, right? So the medicine, for instance, that Cavendish comes up with is really gross. It seems to be like extremely overboiled milk, curdled milk that you eat to make yourself throw up. She apparently loved to vomit. That was her #1 cure for everything. In fact, Mayern says, please stop her from vomiting so much. She's going to hurt herself because she doesn't listen to her physicians. So clearly that medicine was successful because it would definitely make you sick, right? I mean, it would. So, and the way in which they experienced this particular evacuation was as part of the process for healing. So that is a kind of empirical marker for success, although, you know, we might think today we have somewhat improved ones. So I don't know if that answers your question or gets at it, but yeah.
You know, I get that, but then what is different from this versus getting a sort of like empirical result in a scientific experiment? Is there something about the openness of it, or?
Well, I mean, it's not so different than it's a kind of result, but I think the difference is a couple of things. One is control. That is, and this is one of the things that we try to see in the recipe manuals is sometimes they don't work until you see them modify the ingredients a little bit. But the second thing is the way in which we index the empirical success of a medicine is tied to different kinds of objective measures. Not just, I mean, these are kind of gross measures in both the terms of being gross and being gross, right? That is, we're interested in, for instance, with all these vaccines, we're interested in the immune response or whatever it is that we're measuring. So it's not a question, I think, of a difference in kind, but a difference in the subtlety and nature of those measurements that we're looking at. And I don't think that's an ignorant question. I think that's a really good question, actually.
Okay. Thank you. That was helpful for me. Okay, so are there more questions? Oh, Dolores has a question for Philip. Dolores?
Philippe, thank you so much. So I just wanted to ask, how eccentric is it for someone like Müller to be considered in the history of neurophysiology? I mean, you give one example of a Cambridge neurophysiologist who cites him. But would you say that that would be a sort of counterpart to Damasio's work on Descartes? And, you know, is there a kind of group of people who are interested in making this connection between philosophy and neurophysiology?
Yeah, that's a good question.
And how, you know, how deep do they go? Because, I mean, if you really wanted to go into Spinoza, you'd have to you know, research the Stoics and ideas about emotions being psychophysical experiences and that sort of thing.
Yeah, thank you for your question. In fact, yeah, it's amazing how Müller does not get attention in the Spinoza scholarly, even not by biologists who have much interest for Spinoza's philosophy. You mentioned the Major. You have also Atlan, who published last year a new book, made his PhD on the contemporary biology and Spinoza's philosophy. He wrote a book, I think, of more than 500 pages, but there is no Müller included in this book. There is one reference in Damasio's book, Looking for Spinoza, but what he writes is wrong. He writes that Müller has written something in a year, but Müller was already dead at that moment. So this is an error. I contacted Damasio, but he didn't answer yet. So it's not clear who he means by Müller, because there are several Müllers. There is lots of confusion. You will find in thick books like Radical Enlightenment by Jonathan Israel many Müllers in the table of of index of names, but that's Max Müller or another Müller, not the Johannes Müller. And yes, I recently mailed, I discussed with the Manfred Walter. You know him probably. He's a Spinoza scholar, published 3 volumes on Spinoza's philosophy, and one of the books is Spinoza in Deutschland. And the question was also, why is Müller not so well known among Spinoza scholars, even not in Germany? I remember a discussion with Schröder, Professor Schröder, working already for more than 20 years on Spinoza. Müller, the connection with Müller and Müller was for him completely unknown. And the reason is probably that nowadays if we examine influence of Spinoza's philosophy, we examine the influence mentioned on other philosophy. We see this as part of philosophy, influence of philosophy on other philosophy. And so the influence on science does not get attention. So that's the reason probably why Müller is forgotten. Another reason is that Müller wrote in German. So some of his books, his main book, have been translated, but nevertheless many of his books were not translated, and so this is also a problem. Even Berrios, the Cambridge professor, speaks about Müller and the connection with contemporary psychiatry in a series of publications focusing on publications which does not get much attention. His point is that Müller's work on the fantasy images is a classic book, very important one, but that's not the mainstream opinion among psychologists. There is some interest, as I explained, for the relation between Müller and Spinoza among psychologists. There is an article of Bernard from the 70s, an excellent article. There's also a book that I have here, this book of Farrell, but with also a book on the history of psychology. There is something on Müller and Spinoza, but that's about it to my knowledge. And so Manfred Walter wrote a little paragraph, because there is a paragraph on Spinoza and science in Germany included, but that's it. So the main reason, in fact, that we focus in Spinoza scholarly too much on the influence of philosophers on philosophers within philosophy, and we don't give not enough much attention to the influence on other fields like science, for instance, physiology or other. That's the main reason, I think. Is this an answer to your question?
Yes, but it appears from the chat line that Gabriel and Philip and Dennis have lots to contribute. So I will just I will mute myself.
I'm glad that Gan is there.
Okay, so let's start with Dennis. I think both Gabriel and Philip had things to add from the 19th century perspective, which would be interesting. Dennis?
Okay. Hello. I want to ask something to Philip. This concerns whether Müller has any reference at all to intuitive knowledge in Spinoza and the law that arises from it in part 5. So this is, since Müller has recommended parts 3 to 5, it's an important subject for Spinoza there. Now, I bring this up in part because Goethe is not someone I've really studied, but from having read a couple pieces by Eckhart Förster, Goethe was actually quite interested in this notion of intuitive knowledge from Spinoza. and he said to have tried to put this into effect in his methodology for his physiology of plants, in his work on the physiology of plants. I was wondering whether this somehow finds a way into Müller, or whether this drops out in his taking various aspects of Goethe. Perhaps this didn't find its place in Müller, or perhaps it does. That's what I want to ask about.
Okay, thank you. He does mentions Goethe, and he comments a few aspects of Goethe's publications and thinking, but to my knowledge, he doesn't say anything about the intuitive knowledge expressed by Spinoza in the fifth part of the ethics. I think the main reason for this is that, as he explains also, at the moment he clarifies his methodology in his handbook, that he wants to focus not on essences, he wants to focus on what Spinoza would call knowledge of the second kind as a scientific, and he gives a clear definition in his book to start with of physiology. He acts really as a scientist, and he keeps himself on the level of the first and the second kind of knowledge, and he doesn't intervene in this level of talking about bodies in terms of essences, talking about intuitive knowledge. This is really skipped from his discourse. I hope this is an answer to your question.
Yes, in what sense, concerning what sense Spinoza it does. In Goethe, Goethe apparently changes some things about he uses the concept of intuitive knowledge, but it changes in part by he wants to see progression of kinds and to have a general idea of them simultaneously, and that's supposed to be the third kind of knowledge, but it doesn't bring the Spinozistic essences into it. That's why it's somewhat different, and that could have perhaps found a path into Müller, but you're saying that doesn't.
No.
Okay.
No. Thank you.
Right. So do either Gabriel or Philip want to make their comment also out loud? I think Gabriel has interesting stuff about
Okay,
Goethe,
that's fine.
if they want to.
Sure.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi. Well, I'm kind of fidgeting here as a historian of 19th century German neuroscience.
Glad to meet you.
Hi. Well, I think that Müller's work on subjective vision alludes quite explicitly to Goethe's theories on vision. I think that's correct. And if you look at the remarks of Müller's scientific philosophy, there's a direct allusion to Goethe's scientific philosophy. And the guy I work on, who's Emile Dubois-Aymon, one of Müller's students, and as you saw in my comment, writes the first and most detailed assessment of Müller's scientific work. He absolutely confirms everything you said about Müller's debt to Spinoza, but he paints a kind of two-part aspect to Müller's life. He says that the first part of Müller's life is more romantic, and Müller's under the influence of Goethe and Spinoza Naturphilosophie. And then in the second part of his scientific career, he abandons that for a more hard-nosed experimentalist scientific approach. Now, Dubois-Aymon's characterization of Müller as having rejected the romantic errors of his youth has been rightly criticized, but this is a complicated issue. Basically, what we're discussing is the issue of pantheistic or romantic, or you could say naturphilosophic ideas in 19th century German science. And that is something that has received a lot of attention, and there's some debate over it. But I could just go on and on. So I'll let Philip maybe comment.
Okay, then thank you very much for this remark. And Of course, what you said about Goethe, that's right, but the former question was about the link between intuitive knowledge and Goethe and Spinoza. So that there is no link to my knowledge in that domain. And yes, the link with pantheism, panentheism also brings us to an interesting question in Müller's scholarly. That's the question whether Müller was only influenced by philosophy at an early stage in his career or not. Hagner, probably you know his work on his publication on Müller. And he contested the view that Müller was only interested and influenced in the beginning of his career. I think my quotes from the Handbuch have clearly shown that there is an influence of philosophy also in his later work. So I have given many quotes from Müller, from Spinoza's work, in his main work. And of course, once his system was solid, at the end of his life, when he had lots of, as you know, psychological problems, he was really in trouble, then he focused on really what we would call scientific particular problems. Also, the term pantheism, of course, is a term which Spinoza never uses. So it's a term introduced later by also by German people. But of course, we have to take care with this. There are many elements of Spinoza's philosophy which were important for Müller, but Müller had, of course, also the idea that he was a vitalist, and that's a difference between Spinoza. He had really a difference, an ontological difference between living things, which had a vital force, as he called it, without being clear what that actually means. And then you had the other things, that's something which we don't find really so strict in Spinoza's philosophy. Yeah, of course, he was a 17th century thinker. He did not, as Foucault have explained, he didn't have clear ideas of what life actually was, and he had a very broad definition, opposed to Descartes, who had a really narrow definition. Because perhaps you can add something more to this. Oh no, we should keep in contact and discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think Philip is here anymore. He had a note about Darwin's annotations and Müller, but I wanted to ask about another big figure here. What about Kant? So if I remember correctly, every time Kant talks about biology, Spinoza is sort of an alternative to be rejected, especially in questions of how did life start. So I was wondering, if Müller was influenced by Kant, is his Spinoza uncut, or is it, Kant's kind of Spinoza? We know that you told us that, he has the books and everything, but is there some dialectic here?
Yeah, of course. Often Müller is presented as a Kantian, yeah, but that's also a view that has been contested recently by many people. The fact is, then on the other hand, the role of Spinoza has been almost forgotten, although, as I have shown, there are many quotes, references, and to Spinoza's work. Moreover, Spinoza is the philosopher Müller mentioned the most in the second volume of his. He very seldom refers to Kant, which does not mean that there is no influence of Kant, of course, but I disagree with the fact that he's mainly a Kantian. Do you have a particular point presenting him as a Kantian? No. So,
no.
So as I have shown, there are many explicit references to essential elements of Spinoza's philosophy. So I think we should Spinoza more in the spot rather than, of course, at that period everybody had a certain Kantian influence to a certain extent, but here we should put Spinoza first, I think.
Perfect. Good advice. All right. So are there more questions or should we wrap up? This is the last call for questions. If there's nothing else, then I think we should thank our speakers. Maybe unmute yourself so we can like hear applaud. Thank you. I put Philip's email in the chat a little earlier. So if you want to drop him a note for the draft, that would be great.
Can we have Benny? Can we have Benny's slides?
Sure. Yeah.
Let
me double check to make sure they're all okay. But yeah, send me an email. I'm happy to.
Yeah, Benny, could I put your email in the chat as well for that?
Yes, please put it. Wait, my paper will be written right when it needs to be, which is sooner than I want. Yeah.
Okay. So,
but I'm happy if you guys have anything to add, to say, to disagree with. I'm happy for any emails.
Great. Okay. So both.
Thank you guys very much. Thank you.
I will put my presentation on my academia page.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.